Today we're going to review the skill theme of jumping and landing. When we think about jumping and landing, we want to first focus on the key observation points. Jumping and landing is more complicated than most people believe it to be, because when you think about jumping and landing, you have to think about three stages. But in the beginning, you have a variety of things that you're going to be looking for. As you notice on this bullet point, you're focusing on hips, knees, ankles bend, arms extend upward, extend body stretch, hips, knees, ankles bend, shoulders, knees, ankle align. In other words, your progression can be very complicated. So as teachers, we have to be aware of the different stages of jumping and understanding what to focus on during those stages. When you look at jumping for distance, again, very complicated, and we have to be aware of certain terminology and certain vocabulary in the different stages. Arms back, knees bent, arms extend forward, extend body, arms forward, hips, knees, ankles bend on landing. Now, to make one thing clear, you're not going to be saying these words while a kid is jumping for height, but also jumping for distance. So let's go back to the previous slide, looking at jumping for height, and let's focus on the pictures to see what's happening. In picture 1, you'll notice that the child has a good bend and the arms are back, and many times children are going to swing their arms because this helps them in preparation for jumping for height. In the second picture, you see the arms are coming forward, and you're going to start to see a extension of the legs. In picture 3, you have the extend body stretch. And while the child is in the air, you see the full extension. When the child lands, now we're going to focus on hips, knees, and ankles bend. And then finally, shoulders, knees, and ankles align. And so you look at the shoulders, you look at the knees, and you look at the ankles. You should have a good alignment with all three. If a child's shoulders get too far forward, they're going to fall forward and not have the balance. You want to maintain that center of gravity. So when you're watching a child land after jumping for height, this is what you should look for. Now, jumping for distance, again, very similar. Arms back, arms coming forward as a child is going into the extension of the body. Now, one thing I will point out in this picture, this child has arms that are flexed. At this point, the arms should be going straight and they should be moving forward. Notice the child as they're traveling through the air, you have good flexion, and then the legs are coming forward in preparation for landing. And again, notice the shoulders, the knees, and the ankles. You have good alignment, which is going to allow a child to maintain balance with a good center of gravity. So when we think about jumping, a couple of things we want to focus on. With jumping, the locomotor pattern in which the body propels itself off the floor or apparatus into the momentary period of flight. If you look at the two previous slides, you'll notice that a child is in flight here and here. And you'll also notice that a child is in flight here and here. So with both jumping for height and jumping for distance, flight does occur. It's performed for two reasons, those that we just went over, height and distance. And many activities require children to effectively jump for height and or distance. So one of the reasons we focus on teaching these two particular skills is because of many activities that they're going to do in the future. It will require them to be able to jump not only for height, but also sometimes for distance. Preschool children are developmentally capable of performing a variety of jumping actions, and they do it because they enjoy it. Sometimes as teachers, we don't necessarily enjoy teaching jumping and landing because, again, we don't put ourselves in the shoes of a child. We think, well, this is easy. This is not very exciting. I don't think the children are enjoying this. But it is very enjoyable for young children because their body is in flight. They're in the air. And for children, that is totally cool. So now we move on to fundamental jumping and landing pattern. These are a variety of things that you can do to help a child develop in the skill of jumping and landing. For example, a 2-foot takeoff to a 1-foot landing. Again, very complicated because the child has to maintain balance on one foot. 2-foot takeoff to a 2-foot landing. A little bit easier just because now they're able to balance with 2 feet instead of 1. Starting off from a balanced position, a 1-foot takeoff to landing on the same foot, otherwise known as a hop. If we reverse it, or excuse me, if we go opposite of that, a 1-foot takeoff to landing on the other foot, we consider that to be a leap. And again, those are part of jumping and landing. And then finally, a 1-foot takeoff to a 2-foot landing. When you're teaching jumping and landing, children should think of jumping as 3 phases. And this is what we were talking about earlier when we were looking at the pictures. The first phase is the takeoff. Actions of the body as it's propelled off the ground. So again, bending the knees, swinging the arms back and forth, and then propelling the body forward before the feet is off the ground. When the feet do leave the ground, actions of the body while it's off the ground in the air, this is known as the flight phase. And then finally, the landing phase, action of the body as it's reestablished contact with the ground. So again, when we think about teaching and jumping and landing, look at it in 3 different phases. There are certain cues that you want to remember during the takeoff phase. There's cues you want to remember during the flight phase. And there's also cues for the landing phase, which should make our job as teachers easier when we're presenting this information to the students. And so finally, we look at the different levels, different skill levels for jumping and landing. With pre-control, it's exploration, so you're jumping for fun, for height and distance. You're jumping a rope and jumping and landing in different patterns. Now, let me emphasize one point. When you're jumping a rope, you want to start out by jumping over the rope instead of actually swinging a rope. So again, please understand the difference between the two. Control level task, basic jumping variations with emphasis on vigorous takeoffs, variations in flight, and controlled landing. Variations in flight is going to refer to what our body does while we're in the air. Do you want them to do a half turn? Do you want them to try to turn all the way around? So there's different things they can do while they're in the flight phase. Utilization involves the combination of other movements, complicated rhythms, or while manipulating objects. So you see the task is getting more difficult. And then again, proficiency level. As always, think about it in a game situation. So you want to encourage children to jump high and far enough to carry out complex maneuvers. Refine jumping and landing patterns for creative and functional purposes. So how is jumping and landing going to be beneficial in that game situation? And so again, jumping and landing, this gives us an example of some different activities you can do at the 4 levels. For example, proficiency, hurdle and jumps, jumping, dancing, and imagery. Utilization, throwing and catching while jumping. The control level, you'll notice there are a variety of activities that you can work on at the control level, including jumping a self-turned rope and also jumping a turned rope, which are very popular activities in the elementary with the elementary age. And then finally, pre-control, jumping over a swinging rope. 2 people would swing the rope back and forth. That child would try to jump as the rope when the rope comes in their direction. And then finally, jumping for height and distance, and then different patterns of jumping and landing. So this should give you a better understanding of how a child develops when we talk about the skill theme of jumping and landing.